what do you consider to be an activist lawyer, and would you consider yourself one?
Well, I'm very concerned about the use of labels. It's easy for politicians to do that if they're particularly wishing to denigrate people. They will attach labels. So when they say activists, what they mean is that they are in some way or another going beyond what they should do, that it's illegitimate, and that they are therefore not genuine lawyers in some way. That's what they're trying to say. And that they're getting in the way of government measures, particularly in the law and order field. Now, this is not new. This approach of castigating, labeling and categorizing lawyers who not only do cases in court, but actually carry through issues into the communal and social field, and therefore campaign for change, which could be on any front. Obviously, there are lots of issues to campaign on, environmental issues particularly at the moment. And that's what they don't like. They don't like the fact that you are going beyond that, only they don't want to spell it out too much. But this has happened before throughout the whole of my career. I started off many, many years ago now, over 50 years ago. And what they used to say about me, a phrase that's never used now, they called me a red under the bed, which was a phrase indicating that I was some kind of closet communist. And I was actually not affiliated with any group, and I wasn't affiliated with any group of thought processes or politics or political theory. I wasn't. I'd done philosophy at university. I was very interested in, if you like, paradigms of thought, but I wasn't and couldn't be then labeled. So I got very angry about it because they were doing it just because I was raising issues that related to, if you like, equality, related to fairness. And I couldn't understand why, if you did that, you became labeled as a red under the bed. But that's what happened. So that happened at the beginning. So this is not new to me to be approached in this way. And then obviously it became actually very threatening during a period when I was defending a lot of people who were charged with offences who were part of the Irish community. I started with a pair of sisters called the Price Sisters, who were responsible for bombs in London in 1973, one of which blew up my car. And I ended up defending them, but I got a lot of disapproval, and mostly vocal. It wasn't written so much, as being some kind of traitor for defending them and defending others who were wrongly convicted, as it turned out, in the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4. And those who criticized me during that period did apologize later and say you were right to do what you did. But at the time, it was very difficult, and I got death threats and so on. And in the case of one particular lawyer in Belfast called Pat Finucane, who was often doing a lot of work with nationalists and Republicans, and politicians again had to go at him and claim that, in fact, that he was basically some kind of terrorist. And of course, he ends up being shot dead in front of his family. So the lawyer got murdered. Now, that's never been properly resolved. The politicians who spoke out against him won't admit that what they had to say, which was not pleasant about him, contributed to a culture of disparagement of lawyers. And now we've got this current situation in which Boris and Pretty Patel particularly have castigated activist lawyers for, in some way, getting in the way of, well, I think in the first place, it's supposed to be cases concerned with immigration. And then there was an attack on a firm of solicitors, a particular individual. It's disgraceful. Now, although I think it's something like 800 people signed a petition very recently, which included the judiciary, members of the judiciary, senior members of the profession, solicitors, barristers, and others, academics, 800, asking Boris and Pretty Patel to withdraw, and they haven't. They haven't withdrawn. Now think about it. What it means is that you have politicians who are making, we say, anyway, I say, baseless allegations against a profession that is trying to do a job of ensuring that we maintain values of democracy that matter, not just talking about free speech, but talking about free association, talking about all those things, due process, for example, and pursuing that in the courts as well as outside the courts when it doesn't happen. So for all of us, it's good to see there's a certain element of a considerable element of solidarity. And I think it's shocking that Boris and Pretty Patel have not been prepared to withdraw their remarks. And that will not be forgotten.
And what do you think is going on inside their sort of mind, their thinking, when they've decided not to?
Oh, I think it's a culture which is, as I say, it's gone on for some time, decades. Within government, it's those lawyers who speak out, basically. They're very happy if you're contained within a box within a courtroom and you just do one case after another case after another case. But the moment you, as it were, spread the word outside the courtroom and you are active in a political way, I don't mean with a big P, politics, I don't mean party politics, but you're active with, the most obvious thing is campaigns, but I mean, speaking up for communities, leading opposition to certain measures that the government wants to come in. Their thinking is, these are subversive lawyers. We've got to make sure that they're curtailed. Now, if it was, I don't know, North Korea or even what's happening in Thailand, or even lawyers are under threat throughout the world by regimes who see them as effective opposition and not as a subservient profession which just does its job within the context of a case, but actually it's trying to reach a wider public. So I think it's once the lawyer steps outside the courtroom and engenders a wider public, then they get concerned that their position is going to be shown up for what it is. And that is why, for example, Keir Starmer, who's taken over the leadership of the Labour Party, there are a lot of lawyers in the House of Commons. And of course, what was noticed was that he has a certain forensic skill. And, whilst they can confront that in the chamber, what they don't like is that sort of skill being employed outside to the public at large and alerting people to how their rights are being eroded at this minute, which they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously the first thing that sort of comes to my mind is we're a society that's built on the rule of law and keeping, government and everything in check. How do you think we move forward? Like, where do we strike the balance in working together?
Well, no balance has been struck at all. I mean, what's happened is you've got a government that's come in on a one-liner, let's get it done, the Brexit business. Boris, has succeeded in getting an 80-seat majority. That's a big majority, and he knows he can get away with anything. Mm-hmm. And since it's crisis management now, of course, he didn't expect COVID, but he's got it. And the government is in a mess because they haven't planned for the pandemic, which they should have done. They haven't planned, and as a result, they're going from week to week, changing their mind on exactly what they want to do and how they want to deal with it. Now, some of that involves obviously people's freedoms and so on, and one has to keep a balance between the two. But Boris thinks the rule of law is what I say it is. That's what he says. He thinks, I've got the majority, I set the laws, and that's it. So if I set laws that themselves break the law, that's okay. And that is the iniquity of what is happening at this minute with a bill that isn't terribly sexy, and people don't want to really talk about the internal market bill, but that's a very crucial bill because it demonstrates an arrogance of power by Boris and the Brexiteers that actually what we're going to do is we're going to break those promises he made last December in order to get over the line with the election. He made promises about the peace process in the north of Ireland being preserved, and that there would be exceptions made for the north of Ireland in relation to the kind of border, soft border, hard border, and all that. Agreement was reached. And now he passes a bill in which he accepts that he's going to, if he carries out the clauses 42 and to 45, I think it is, in the bill, he accepts that he will be breaking all of the promises. Now, never mind, the fact that morally and reputationally, the UK is going to slide downhill if it does this, because if some other nation did it, they'd be right on the back saying, lawless nation, banana republic and all that. But that's what he's doing. And for a lot of people, obviously, they won't necessarily have picked up on this because who's following the internal market bill? But a lot of lawyers here again, some of them within the Conservative Party, 3 previous attorney generals are voting and have voted against it in the House of Lords. The House of Lords rejected this bill, or these parts of that bill, sent it back to the House of Commons. And what's the House of Commons saying? This is last week. Well, we don't care what the House of Lords say. We're going to carry on as we were. So we're now facing a situation in the next month in which there is a strong possibility we'll get a no-deal Brexit, which I think a lot of people weren't, even those who voted for Brexit, were not wanting a no deal because he promised there would be a deal by the end. That was the whole thing. Get it done, get it done. And so I think you have to see the two riding together here. And so I think that there are a lot of other bills that are going through in which it's very, very difficult to challenge because he's got a majority. The Labour Party are all over the place because as of today, Corbyn's out. Yeah. Now he's back in again, but he's not really all the way back. He's back into the Labour Party, but not the Parliamentary Labour Party. So the Labour Party are, well, in my view, they're not quite a spent force, but they're soon going to be a spent force. So there's no real political opposition. And in the absence of no real political opposition, who is going to bring the government to account? Back to activist lawyers going to court and judicially reviewing policies that have not been subjected to due process and which are, we would say in some cases, the internal market bill is one, are unlawful. So that's where we come in. And so we're providing, if you like, a reconstruction of the rule of law and the balance that you talk about, because the balance has gone altogether.
Yeah.
The rule of law has gone out the window. And it's only, lawyers who are politicians and lawyers outside the House of Commons who are pointing out that we are heading towards a very lawless situation in which basically what we have in this country is an elected dictatorship.
Yeah, I feel like it's so important to discuss these things because if you're just going day by day, you probably don't even think about it as that. But as you explained it, that is essentially what's happening, which is a little bit frightening.
Well, I'll give you another example because, obviously, having one example is something, but there is another one going through at the moment, which I'm very worried about because, well, I'll explain what it is, first of all, that's going through. It's a bill. It's called the Kill Bill, but that's just as, it's to do with spy cops. It's to do with the fact that they are passing legislation to legitimize the use of undercover agents within the United Kingdom by government agencies, not just the police. It could be HMRC, it could be other state agencies, employ undercover operatives. Now, in order to do that, they've got to be given, and they are given, a certain immunity to do things which are probably not otherwise permitted. Now, strictly, they should operate within the law. But this bill is going to enable them to operate outside the law, break the law, commit crime, and they will have, it's possible, they will have the ultimate weapon, which is the power to kill you. So how many people know about this? Now, these operatives are called CHIS, Covert Human Intelligence Sources. Again, it's like the internal market. You say that to somebody and they glaze over. They don't want to know about this. But actually, if you say spy cops, maybe they're interested. Now, the reason I'm interested is there's an inquiry opened last 2 weeks ago called the Undercover Policing Inquiry, which is examining the activities of undercover police officers over the last 40, 50 years. And unbeknown to a lot of people, certainly outside the normal run of things, you wouldn't pick up on this. There was something called a special demonstration squad. Now, what that was a police force within a police force. And what the inquiry is looking into is who set it up, who paid for it, what were their powers, what did they do? We know some of what they did was to infiltrate environmental groups who were doing nothing illegal, particularly at all, usually protest groups. And they were so concerned that the officers who did the infiltration were either authorized or a blind eye was turned to it. They befriended it, usually men befriending women, who then became their partners and then had children. And it was only much later these women woke up and suddenly realized, oh my God, I've been living with a cop who's been feeding intelligence on our protests to, whether it's the Greenham women at the peace camp at Greenham Common or elsewhere. Now, all of that is interesting because one of the people that was spied on, lawyers have been spied on, and I'm one of them. And so I'm very interested. I've got representation in the inquiry. I want to find out who authorized for me to be under surveillance for 4 or 5 years during the Lawrence inquiry. What was it they were wanting to find out? What did they do with the information? And so on. So these are quite important for the rule of law and for the preservation of a so-called democratic society. And I think, unless I or you or this Pulse blog, podcast, whatever it's going to end up as, chat, Instagram, whatever. And people need to know what's going on in their name because we're paying for it. It's coming out of taxpayers' money. And therefore, it's not the power you see in the House of Commons, it's the power you don't see that is being exercised in this way. And somebody's got to keep a very, very strong eye on all of this. And that's where, again, activist lawyers come into this.
Can I ask, how did you find out that you were spied on?
Well, I didn't find out. It came about because, well, there were 2 ways to this. An undercover officer called Peter Francis, I'm not sure whether that's his real name, blew the whistle in a national newspaper about what was going on, mainly in the environmental lobby. At the same time as he was blowing the whistle on what was going on, and he blew the whistle about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's only just, the inquiry's only just got off the ground. It's been in the running for about 6 years. So he probably blew the whistle now, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago. But at the same time as he was blowing the whistle, I was still representing Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, mainly Mrs. Lawrence, Doreen, in relation to her ongoing concerns that the recommendations made by Macpherson in the Macpherson inquiry into her son's murder were carried out. But they, that is Neville and Doreen, had always maintained that there were a number of other aspects of what went on in the Lawrence inquiry that they wanted answers to. Their main concern was they felt they'd been infiltrated. The family had been infiltrated by police. And they suggested that the route was through liaison officers. So we campaigned on that issue. And myself and Imran Khan, who was the solicitor, pressed for an opportunity to speak to the Home Secretary of the time, which was Theresa May, before she became Prime Minister. And we had 2 or 3 meetings with her in which we said, as clearly as we could that this matter of undercover policing and also some very odd occurrences in the investigation into her son's murder needs to be followed up, because basically they were saying there was corruption within the police at that time, which flowed on after the murder itself and the original investigation, and there was still going on at the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. So in the end, Theresa May agreed that she would set up an inquiry into that aspect of Stephen Lawrence's murder and its investigation. As a result of that, the barrister who was deputed to do the task, and a barrister called Ellison, did something called the Ellison Review, in which he discovered, through his own endeavors, that a number of people were spied on, surveyed, watched, whatever you like to call it. And one of them was me. So he found that out. I didn't know. I've always thought that I was, a target from the beginning. If I'm called a red under the bed, they're hardly going to send me, cookies, are they? They're bound to be doing something else. So that's why there is now an interest in the undercover inquiry, because it's looking at what happened to the Lawrences and indirectly what happened to me. So that's the current state of affairs.
There's something to definitely keep our eyes peeled out for. I definitely didn't know about it until you'd mentioned in an email, and then I was reading it off and I was very shocked to find out. So, yeah. So I think this is exactly the sort of topic that we want to bring, into the public domain, more engageable, sort of through social media and everything like that, because it is such a pressing issue. So yeah, thank you for explaining and bringing it to light. But I mean, aside from that, because I actually really wanted to write a profile about you, so I want to get to know you a bit more. I suppose, what was your route into law, and why did you choose civil liberties and human rights?
Well, there is a quick answer to this. Mm-hmm. Buy the book.
oh yeah, okay, so it's all in that.
It is, yes. I've written a book with help of others called Memoirs of a Radical Lawyer.
Okay.
It's just got my name on it. Okay. Published by Bloomsbury. It's still out there. I think you can get 2 for the price of 1 on Amazon at the moment. But I'm very proud of the book in the sense that it took a lot of blood, sweat and tears to write it. And it's written in a particularly friendly, conversational way. So you don't have to read it cover to cover, but you could, pick it up and just read an odd chapter. And they're self-contained accounts, including how I got into this in the first place. So I do recommend you just have a quick read of some of it anyway, because it'll tell you more than there's time to recount. But I think the main route was, I don't come from a well-to-do family. I don't have a lot of property or money or anything like that. My parents were economically very constrained. My father was disabled, but he worked on the railways, and that's where I was going to go, working on the railways. So we were a railway family, nothing to do with the law whatsoever. However, 2 things happened that made a difference, I think. One was that my mother had a strong sense of justice. And she used to have a routine whereby, and this is years and years and years ago, my father couldn't drive. So he would sit in the car, but she could drive. And it was a sort of, you probably won't know what a Ford Anglia looks like, the original sit up and beg, very old. And they had one of those, and she used to go shopping every week, same time, same place, Sainsbury's in North London in Whetstone. And on this particular occasion, she came back and found that a police officer had been there, because somebody said the police officer's been looking at your car. And then she was summoned for illegal parking. In those days, no yellow lines. She parked between the studs on either side of a pedestrian. And she said, no, I would never do that. She said, never. He's lying. And so she defended herself and she went to court. It got reported because nobody ever defended a parking fine. And she refused to pay it and said, no, I'm not paying this. I didn't do it. And there are no cameras, so it was word against word. And everybody said, you know, it's a police officer saying you did. And anyway, she takes it to court, but she wins. How does she win? Because the police officer forgot or didn't notice there was someone in the car, and it was my father. And my father was able to, it's that very Perry Mason-like, sort of come in on walking sticks and say, she never parked there. She never ever parks there. Blah, blah, blah. Got acquitted. And after that, she kept saying to me, and I was quite young at the time, probably 8 or 9 or something, she just said, Michael, you know, if they're prepared, she called them blue bottles. If blue bottles are prepared to lie about me over that, just imagine what they're doing to everybody else. So I sort of thought, yeah, well, that's an interesting point. It's probably right, actually. And so that sort of pervaded wherever we went, whatever we did. She said, you watch him. If she saw a police officer, say, watch him. Not, oh, good afternoon. Quite the opposite. So there was no deference paid in that way. And then it was in the early days of television. We didn't have a television for years, but in the end, going to see friends who did have televisions, I got familiar with a series. It was a series, an American series, in which I think it was a father and a son. It might have been 2 brothers. I can't remember. It's such a long time ago. In which it was a series each week in which they hardly ever won a case, but they took on really important issues, social issues, to do with housing, to do with abortion, to do with, well, obviously crime as well. So across the gamut. And I so loved this series. I thought, God, I'd like to do that. It was sort of representing people who had hopeless situations, who couldn't speak for themselves, but along came this firm of lawyers who got to know them as people, got to know the issues, pursued it in court, even though they didn't always win. The clients would always be thankful that somebody given them a chance, articulated the case. And as a result of watching that week in, week out, I thought, I think I could do that. I would like to try and do that. And everybody said, oh, you're mad. What do you want to do? And of course, we didn't have any contacts. And I just went on asking, well, where could I go to do this? What is this job? And they said, well, the nearest we can think is, you know, why don't you become a barrister? I'd never heard of barristers. I didn't know anything about barristers. And so I looked at it and people said, you can't do that. You need money. You need money and you need connections. I didn't have either. So I've never kind of been put off any more than my mother was. So I thought, well, I'll pursue this. And I actually went into the temple in London because I was told that's where they all are. And I just knocked on a door, the first one I came to. And I said, you know, have you got barristers here? And they said, yeah, we do. Why? What do you want? I said, I want to be one. And they said, well, you can't be one here. You have to go and train. I said, well, how do I do that? Anyway, somebody sat down and bothered to tell me what to do. So I went away and did it. And, you know, a few years later, I went back there and I said, hey, it's me again. I've got qualified. And they said, oh, all right, then you can, what do you want? I said, I want a pupillage. And they said, people don't normally come and knock on the door. I said, no, but I'm here now, you know. And it went on from there. And it was just a question of pushing at doors. You can't do that anymore. Although I do suggest to people the personal approach matters far more. I can't stand emails. I can't stand the online applications. We're all going mad. I know COVID makes it very difficult for the personal approach. Maybe we haven't got an option at the moment. But so that was the route in. It was somewhat unusual and certainly not traditional. So I didn't go to Oxbridge. I didn't go to any of those. So
testament to hard work pays off.
Well, I think it's persistence and having a clear view of what it is you want to do. That's difficult. I was lucky in the sense that I got it from my mum, and I thought, yeah, I've got to do something like that.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I told it to somebody yesterday, in fact, I often forget, I was born during the war. I mean, the Second World War, not the first. And my father was doing emergency work on the railways, and he, because of his work, he had a special supply of bananas every week, which like gold dust then. But he was very anxious that we, that's my mother and I, didn't eat them. And I couldn't understand. I said, "There's something wrong with them." They said, no, I'm going to give them to people who haven't got anything. And so my mother would drive in during the wartime, the Blitz. She would drive round giving the bananas. She wouldn't let me get out of the car, sit in the car, washing hands. And I thought there's some strange power inside these bananas that I don't. And she, but it rubbed off in the sense I thought afterwards, obviously many years later, I realized, you know, what a extraordinary thing to do in difficult circumstances is to give away the thing that, you know, in a sense, I'm not saying I suffered as a result of not having a banana, but I didn't. I think the opposite, that I gained from learning about giving rather than taking. Simple as that, really.
That's a really lovely story.
So that was the routine.
Okay, and I note the name of the book, which I'll
okay
or name in my article.
Yeah.
I suppose you get this one quite a lot, but what has been your proudest achievement or the highlight of your career?
Gosh, that's a difficult one, because the longer I go on, you know, the more interesting and more in a way more diverse cases come my way, and they all have a place in my heart, really. And it's invidious to sort of choose one that made all the difference. And now I think the importance for me has been from the beginning is the people I represent. Now, it might be one person or it might be a whole body of people. And I like to listen hard, and I learn fairly quickly by listening to other people's experiences. And that's provided me with a sort of a tapestry of different themes and threads, which I've been able to build on. So they've informed me, and I've been able to give back something to them. So it's the ability to identify an injustice, and then say, right, well, I think we can do something about that. Let's see how we can do something about that. And then you work together. So I can't really pinpoint one. It's not like the road to Damascus and suddenly you see something. I can't say that. I could mention cases, but, you know, in one breath, I'd have to mention 6 or 7. They're all the same, because they're all the same in the sense that it's the clients, it's the families. I mean, I'm doing the Grenfell one at the moment, and it's the families. You learn from them, because on the whole, I've been very fortunate, and I haven't been a victim in the way that some of the families I represent have been. So I listen hard. I want to know what it's like and what they have to put up with and how we might do something about it. So that's it, really. I know it's not a single word answer, but there you go.
No, it's interesting. It sounds like you're very much driven by wanting to help people,
yeah,
and achieve justice.
I think it's about recognizing that I'm really lucky. I've had a secure upbringing, nothing grand, but very secure. And I've had a family. I have a lovely wife, Yvette, who's sitting in another room, and she provides amazing sport, and I provide sport for her, I hope. So, I mean, you know, I'm lucky, for God's sake, I'm really lucky, and I'm alive. So, you know, I automatically, I think my father had a phrase, I used to get really fed up hearing about it. but it happened a lot in those days, and it's semi-racist in a way. I think I don't think he meant to be, but it really is. When you say it now, he would say, if I didn't eat everything I had on my plate, he'd say, just you think about the starving millions in India. And I go, you know, and of course, he said it so often that it just rolled off his tongue, you know, but actually it was you wouldn't dare say it now. And of course it's, you know, what about the starving people in Manchester and Leeds and everywhere else? You know, there's starving people all over the place, and trying to, you know, rid the world of poverty and all the rest of it. That if you're lucky enough to have your health, and I'm lucky enough to have health enough to stand up, health enough to think, then I think we have an obligation. I feel we've got an obligation to repay it to the world, the environment in which we live. So, and I wouldn't be happy if I wasn't doing that. I don't want to sit around and just moon at the moon.
Like to be busy, I can tell. Okay, cool. Let's see what else I've got. So obviously you've had a very long and interesting career. How do you handle the pressure of, you know, being involved in high profile cases?
Oh, I think, well, the main way is, I think a psychotherapist said, you're a very centered person. And in a sense, I do internalize it, because I don't, if I'm representing someone, I don't want them to feel that I'm not, in a sense, in control. So it gives them more confidence if I can be in control. How do I do that? Well, I'm pretty good at shutting things out mentally. If I think it's getting in the way, I just shut it down, and that's quite difficult to do. But I've learned the technique of doing it, and ensuring that I do it. Otherwise, I go mad. And I have been helped throughout, actually, the 50 odd years. I have a number of children, and I found that besides, obviously they're not the same mother, but besides the mother of the children, as well as it's the children that have made an enormous difference. Except at the moment I'm with Yvette, and we don't have any children here, so that's that. But in the really stressful beginning, you know, I'd come home and maybe there are five children, and there's no way they're wanting to know about what you've done. They want you to know what they've done, which is fine. So I would get involved in what they're doing. And then I couldn't do all the things that they did. I wasn't bad at sport, so I could play football and cricket and tennis and squash and things like that. But I wasn't very good at skiing and all the other things they got up to. Horse riding, hopeless. But there was a preoccupation with their welfare and their interests. And so when I remember Who's Who, they used to come around. They don't do it now, I don't think. And I've got an entry in Who's Who, and they said, what are your hobbies? And I said, my children, because actually that's what I did, including I've got a drum kit here still, which I gave to one of the children, and then he didn't use it so much. And I said, I'll have it back, thank you. So I've got it here. So the other thing I can do when I feel in the mood is to beat hell out of the skins.
So it's an angry drum session.
Well, I used to, if there was in the early days, there were judges that were particularly, I thought, pernicious and difficult to me. And so I'd control myself, because you can't let it go. You have to contain it. If you let it go, you've lost. So I take it home with me. And then I with a pencil, you know, I'd draw on the skin of the drum the face, not very well done, but the face of the judge who I'd been in front of that day. And then I play the drums until it disappeared.
Good technique, good tip as well.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So what attributes do you think makes a good human rights lawyers? A lot of our readers and contributors hope to practice in that field, or some already that already. So yeah, what are the good attributes of one from your experience?
Well, I think you have to. I mean, there isn't a formula, but there is and it's not about these are the criteria 1, 2, 3, A, B, and C, and you've got to satisfy these. No, none of that. It's in here. It's in your heart. You have to have a passion. You have to have a feeling for rectifying injustice. You've got to be you've got to be able to see it, recognize it. In other words, identify the problem and feel strongly that you can do something about it. Now, some people will want to do something about it in different ways. Some may want to go into politics. Some may want to become priests. So, so there are different ways of doing it. But basically, you have to have a spiritual inspiration in the sense of having a sort of vision of the fact that it can't be right that I've got all this and they have nothing. So I'm not going to have all this. Well, I'll hang on to some of it while I do help the other person. And, that's what keeps, Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, which I think is wonderful. And I tried to set up a set of lawyers to do exactly the same task. I think the French have got one that transcends boundaries. But it's having a sense and a feeling for ensuring an element of fairness. Now, I think everybody's got that. I think people are basically, they want to be fair and they don't like unfairness and they don't like oppression. They don't like to see people in straitened circumstances. They want to help, which is why, children in need or giving money for water aid, different parts of the world, does conjure up support. You want to do something. That's it. You have to have the feeling, I want to do something. But you have to feel that strongly that you're not put off, because having the feeling and recognizing it, stage one. Stage two is not losing it, because you might fall at the first hurdle. Somebody turn around and say, who do you think you are? Piss off, don't want to see you. And you might get rejected. Or you might go to an organization. It might be the United Nations. It might be a domestic organization dealing in human rights, and they haven't got space for you. And I'll do something else then. But no, not do something else. If you can't find somewhere to do what you're doing, you have to establish it yourself. You have to create a niche for yourself. If you're convinced, you can do it. If you're not convinced, don't do it, because you won't last. You won't stay the course. So I'm afraid it's nebulous, but those who've got it know it.
And lots of resilience to go with that.
Yeah, a lot of resilience, yes, because you may get rejected, and you've got to be mentally quite fit. So you have this discipline, and physically quite fit as well. It's difficult if you're constantly, under the weather or ill. It's very difficult to, perk up your own spirits as well as everybody else's. So you have to have a certain base of well-being yourself before you set off down this path.
Yeah, good, wise words. Thank you. And is there any advice you would give yourself, to give your younger self, I suppose, personally or in the workspace?
Well, it's difficult because everybody will be working in slightly different spaces, especially now. I mean, things are going to change dramatically, have changed dramatically. They're not going to change back. We're not going to go back to, people talk about the normal. There's never going to be that kind of normal. We're going to have to live with the risk of contracting COVID. Although that risk may get reduced, it may contain, but we have to live with it. So I think the first thing is to not ignore it Because there are some people who are trying to deny that it's happening and think it's a government conspiracy and all that. I'm not in that bracket at all. I think it's a very real threat, but it's something we can deal with, just like a lot of other things are a threat. Walking across the road is a threat, you know, so but we deal with it because we keep alert. So I think the first thing is to recognize what the threat to health and welfare is, and then work out a strategy independently for oneself about how to stay alive, because that's the basic thing. That's why I'm saying you've got to look after your well-being before you do. So, and that's the first space. So the second thing is, I think, is to maintain a level of humor. I'm known for being a bit potty, a bit mad, and I do silly things. People, you know, sort of laugh, and I say that's good. You've got to laugh at these things. You don't laugh at people, but you think of humorous conditions. And when I used to do a lot of jury speeches, and if you read the book, which I assure you will laugh at it, some of it, I usually have a sort of story to tell the jury that links to the case, that has an element of humor in it. And that, because I think it's a very good medium for communicating a serious message. So that's a sense of well-being and keeping yourself safe, sense of humor, which helps you convey the message. I think I'd say, you know, one doesn't want to have too long a list. If you can accomplish that, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah. It's better get started or refine.
Yeah. Well, you have got started.
Well, me personally.
Yeah, you have.
Oh, thanks. I'd like to think so.
Yeah, you have.
And I suppose, what can the current lawyers do to create systemic change? And what would you like to see from sort of budding human rights lawyers?
Oh, I think they've got to ensure that they defend those rights that are important. They're not difficult to define the rights because they're all set out in the European Convention and the United Nations as well. So the various conventions are obvious. I don't need to go through the right to life, the right to say, all those rights. They have to be defended because they're forever under investigation, and they're forever being attacked. They're under attack all the time. The Tories have been saying for ages they want to not only get out of Europe, but actually they want their own Bill of Rights and convention. And, you know, the convention has been blamed for all sorts of things. And of course, Trump's been doing the same in relation to the International Court in The Hague. So it's under attack. So you've got to get out there and defend it. And you've got to be seen to be doing it. So don't, you know, the most obvious thing that's happening at the moment is for a lot of ordinary people, there's no funding for cases. No public funding. I mean, legal aid has dried up. 40% cuts on civil legal aid, and criminal legal aid is very, very restricted. Now, that's a battle to be fought. You've got, and who's going to fight it? It's got to be those who are in it, those who are on the front line and who know what the sacrifices are that are being made. And so that's one of the first battles. It's not only maintaining the principles, but maintaining access to those principles through the courts. For example, a battle that's got to be fought at this minute, in which we are fighting, is this government and previous ones wants to restrict the right to judicial review. They already have. So there are very strict time limits, very strict principles in relation to who can bring a judicial review, no funding. And it's one of the few ways in which you can bring in a government to account is through judicial review. But it won't surprise you to know they've got at the moment, a review of that facility under Lord Fawkes. And I've got a very strong suspicion they're going to make lots of recommendations to restrict its use even more. So that's a battle that's got to be fought. So how do they do it? Well, I think it's important that lawyers not only stand up, but do it collectively. Now, I'm president of the Haldane Society. We're socialist lawyers. You don't have to be a socialist to do all of this. This is human rights work. It's pretty basic. Or if you don't, you don't want to join a political association, although all the others are political with a small p. I mean, obvious places to go. I just give you one example is Amnesty. They need people who will help with regard to the implementation of various conventions and human rights laws. So you don't have to fight on your own. You join a group that does that. And there are lots of groups representing different groups of people, gender-wise and so forth. So I won't write out the list now, but it's not difficult to find. But I think it's absolutely vital. You don't let light sand through your hand. You don't let this all dissipate and disappear. For the next generation, you've got to come, and the land is bare. There's no protections.
Yeah, lots to think about there. What's that? And then I suppose with what's going on at the moment in terms of COVID, how has that sort of changed your working routine?
Well, COVID has changed it entirely because the courts aren't sitting, but obviously they're very constrained in what they can do because of the numbers that can combine. Plus, you've got to travel to get to court, etc. So, in 6 months, I've only done one hearing in person. I wasn't that keen to do that, but in person, I mean. I think that's going to go on. So the result is that the hearings are like this. You do it on a Zoom, and for example, you could be sitting where the judge is, and I'm addressing you with the arguments that relate to the case I've got. And so you might, I've done one or two of those, and it'll go on being like that for quite a long while. Now that is a very different mode of advocacy. So if you're an advocate, which is me, I trade on the fact that I like to, be in the room with you and talk to you direct. And then, I can, I hope, work out the body language, because sometimes people don't say much, but you can tell whether it's going down or it's not, whether they're listening or they're not. But on a Zoom, it's much more difficult because I only see you. The other two judges, I don't see necessarily at the same time unless they've got a particular facility. See, I haven't done that on this. I don't know whether anybody else comes up. No, it's just the two of us. But so, I mean, it's a very different situation. One which, to be honest, I don't enjoy it so much because I don't have that latitude and ability and facility to work out how it's going down. And of course, there are other lawyers in the courtroom and you just have a different feeling. Yeah. But actually, I'm overloaded. I've got more work than I've ever had. Because, if I sit here, it's all coming through the window. In a way it never did. And I couldn't have coped with it before. Whereas now it's one after the other because it's all on, essentially it's all on paper.
Wow. So you think after COVID or, whatever, I don't know, what will the...
No, I think there isn't going to be an after COVID. I think I said a little earlier, it's going to be with us, well, for the rest of my lifetime. I don't know about yours, but certainly for the rest of my lifetime, it's going to be there. Now, you might be able to, as I say, like crossing the road, you might be able to take precautions to avoid getting hit by a bus or the virus. But the fact is, it's there. And, whether it's football matches, symphony halls, courtrooms, shops, they're all going to have, we are all going to have to recognize the risks and accommodate them. So there may come a time where it's not so necessary to wear a mask because maybe it's not effective. It may not be so necessary to limit numbers so you don't have anybody watching a football match. You may have football matches in which, half's on television, the other half are sitting in the seats that are left. And obviously it doesn't make so much money, but the whole economy's got to be rewritten because it's not, people are not going to make money in the same way. And I don't think really people have got, they're constantly thinking, oh, well, we'll be back to normal by Christmas. No, we won't. Back to normal by Easter. No, we won't. not to that normal that we once had. No, the ability just to make spontaneous, sometimes frivolous decisions about what you're doing, you can't do that. You have to think very carefully about who you're going to be with, how many you're going to be with, and for how long. So it's, and I think it's a lesson for all of us, because, you know, I take the blame as much as anybody else. You know, I think we have plundered the planet. And this is the result of endless plundering of the planet, that the pandemics are coming through the weak spots where, nearly always from, you know, markets, wet markets, animals conveying, and so on, and then through to the humans, and humans convey it as well. So I think, you know, we have plundered the resources, and we still continue to do so until we stop doing that. Then and then we get a measure of control over the resources, which we are but custodians for the moment. So I think that's why I think life has changed. It could change for the better, because it may mean that we become far more responsible about ourselves and about, you know, you and others.
Hope so, fingers crossed. And I'll just ask you one last question. What do you think is the biggest reform that's needed to the law?
The biggest reform?
Something that's important to you, I suppose.
Well, I think it's I mentioned it a moment ago, really, but it matters to me a lot because I know how many people are suffering, and that is ready and proper access to justice, which means it's got to be funded. Mm-hmm. There are too many people who can't pursue justice because they can't afford to. So they let it ride, challenging, you know, a dismissal or an eviction, or even a planning decision, whatever it is. Very few people can do much about it. And once you have a democracy in which you can't do very much about how it's run, then that's the biggest thing that's got to change. So that's the target for me. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.